Thank you very much for your patience. Good evening. Once again, for those of you that have not been here before, let me give you some information that you will need to know. First of all, the emergency exits. Most of you are sitting here in the chapel, so there would be the doorway to the rear. There's also a door in the reading room. So if there was any need for us to leave in a hurry, you could use either one of those doors. Some of you have already asked. The restroom is through this opening here, and an immediate right will take you to the restroom. So that said, welcome to St. James Chapel for the third lecture in our 2015 Fireside Chat series. My name is Sue DiLorenzo, and I'm the volunteer coordinator for the chats, along with John and Gloria Golden. Fortunately, fortunately there were no glitches tonight. However, I was speaking about the weather, except for the parking and the mud. Just remember, the mud brings spring, and I don't think any of us can complain that that is somewheres around the corner. So thank you for your tolerance with the weather-related incidences, and also for our delay tonight was obviously beyond our control. Once again, our topic centers around President Franklin Roosevelt, a Hyde Park native and former parishioner at St. James. Tonight we will be discussing his Huguenot connection and how it helped shape his worldview and influence the decisions that he made as president. I had wanted to introduce to you the president of Huguenot Street, but she's the one who has not quite arrived. So as she, at the end of our program, will introduce her to you. Our speaker tonight is Thomas Weikel, Director of Strategic Planning at Historic Huguenot Street. Thomas attended the State University of New York at New Paltz and did his internship at Historic Huguenot Street. Upon graduation with a degree in history, he began work at the site in visitor services and soon became the director of the guest experience, where he created a more in-depth, creative experience for guests. Currently, his new position as Director of Strategic Planning, he is working to bring Historic Huguenot Street up to the national levels and standards. Please help me welcome Thomas Weikel.
No, you can leave it like that. Okay. Thank you, Sue, for that wonderful introduction. You got it all correct. And it's exactly what this lecture is going to be about. President Roosevelt, and specifically his 1942 visit to historic Huguenot Street. But before I begin telling that story, I want to speak a little bit about myself. In my time at Huguenot Street, I have learned through people who lived on the street, people who are descended from the people who founded the street, and the people who work at the site, these little tidbits, these little stories that sort of grew and enveloped the street itself. And one of these stories is the one I'll be telling tonight about this visit. And when I first heard it, yes, very interesting, a president once stopped by for a few moments. But as I studied a bit more and got deeper into the history, I realized that this visit represents something much larger. And this visit can directly apply to ourselves and our situation. And it's often asked of every level of history, so what? If you sit in an elementary school student, you'll have, or as an elementary school student, someone raise their hand, why do we have to study this? As a tour guide, I was asked the exact same thing, and as the one who educates the tour guides today, I'm asked by them, but who cares? And it's this question that, we often struggle with. Why do we need to know this information? Why should we care? And I hope that through FDR, his experience, and maybe even this lecture today, we can get to that idea a little bit more. And so this whole thing started me on a process of asking these historical questions, and rather quickly the answers became clear. So what are these questions? Well, you find out this little story and it's very interesting, and you ask that 3-year-old, 4th grade question, so what? And if you can answer that question, you're then asked a little more difficult question to answer, how so? And for myself and so many of the others that I've spoken to, this is all about yourself. One of my mentors wisely said that history has nothing to do with the past. History is about the present. And so as an individual, who you are is because of your past. And you can immediately think of a handful of events that shaped who you are. And in the decision making that you make throughout your daily life, whether it's the mundane or the deep and meaningful, you are shaped by your past. You hold these values that you either discovered yourself through a change in your life, or that you were taught. And this is part of your historical memory. And if you start thinking about those values, especially the ones that have been taught to you, you start realizing, well, okay, my mother taught me this. How did she find this out? And so maybe it was a historical event in her life, or maybe her mother's. And the sooner the deeper you dig, you realize that this whole moment, this decision you're about to make, is being influenced by generations of history. And that's just for the self. If you apply that a bit wider, and take a whole society, an entire culture, we all share certain values, these certain things that make us the part of the same group. And for this group here, we're all Americans, and we all hold American values. And I could ask you all to raise your hands, and you would tell me liberty, freedom, equality, justice, resilience, these things that are quintessentially American. You know them. You know that that's part of who you are. You know that's what's a part of what makes an American an American. But then you ask yourself, so what? How so? How did we get to this point? And it's going back generations. And you can start first saying quickly, oh, it's my father, my grandparents, and you can go back to, well, it's their grandparents. And eventually we'll reach the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the writing of it. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And these are wonderful ideas. And you said, that's when America started. But I think it goes back even further. I think it starts at a moment before then. Where did Thomas Jefferson get these ideas from? He was born here in this, what they called the New World, what we today call America. And he was born of immigrants. And these immigrants brought to them these same very values. They decided that what their lives could be like in Europe was not good enough, that they weren't okay with the status quo, that the European culture and society wasn't offering them what they needed. And so they decided to take an enormous risk. In a time where most people never left their village, they decided to cross the Atlantic Ocean to arrive here for just the possibility of creating something better. Thankfully, in my mind, they were able to create these sort of sanctuaries, and they based that on these freedoms, these values that we hold. And eventually they said this wasn't enough, that the next generation tested it and questioned it. And they said, no, this isn't enough. We need to separate from our European rule. And then each subsequent generation had to reevaluate themselves, keep asking themselves the question, so what? How so? And when they do that, each generation shifts and changes. And that's exactly what President Roosevelt did when he visited New Paltz. And that's exactly what I did when I studied this. And I hope that while I'm telling this story, you think about me telling you this story, you think about the story itself and maybe your own personal story, and start asking these more historical questions that lead to historic memory and cultural memory. So I'm going to move on from this little introduction and get into the story itself. But before I do that, I think it's necessary to give some historical background. And the very first thing that I have to do is define what a Huguenot is. Now, there are so many definitions. We could spend hours nitpicking about what is a Huguenot, what isn't a Huguenot, who is a Huguenot, who isn't a Huguenot. But for the case of simplicity, I'm going to use a simple but strict definition. A Huguenot is simply a French-speaking Protestant. It has nothing to do with the geography. It has nothing to do with which branch of Protestantism. If they were Protestant and they spoke French, they were a Huguenot. Now, this is a rather large term, so I'm going to add a little caveat and say specifically one from the 15th and 16th century. So with that temporal, regional, linguistic, and religious definition, we can define what a Huguenot is. And as I get on in this story, you'll see that it can get a little bit complicated at who is and who isn't a Huguenot. But with that simple definition, who is a Huguenot, we ask ourselves, how so? And so, what is a Huguenot, really? It's a French-speaking Protestant, fine, but what do they believe in? And I'm going to limit myself a little bit and speak directly to the group of Huguenots that would found and settle New Paltz. They were followers of Jean Calvin, the man so wonderfully etched right here. He was influenced greatly by Martin Luther. Martin Luther nails his 95 Thesis in 1517 and sparks really a revolution, change in the way people believed. And a generation later, 20 years later, Jean Calvin says, yes, but what does that mean, really? So Lutheranism has been sort of jokingly called Calvinism light. John Calvin takes this one step further and says, all the pageantry, all the rituals are all created by man, and he sticks to a very simple definition. If it's not in the Bible, it's not Christian. And he and his theological buddies spend years reading original manuscripts, translating the Bible for themselves, and practice the belief that it's the individual who has a connection to God. It isn't a clergyman, it certainly isn't a pope, that through education, through reading and studying the Bible, you will have a closer relationship with God. And if you follow the rules set within the Bible, you will be a good Christian and be among God's elect into heaven. And so it's this very strict mindset that the people we call the Huguenots are based on. If you are well educated, can read the Bible, and question not only the Bible but your society, you will be a good Christian. You will go into heaven. And this idea is drastically challenging. You'll see next to the painting or the etching of Jean Calvin an image of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. France at the time was a heavily Catholic country. The king, the aristocracy, the general population of France took these ideas as earth-shattering. They believed, truthfully believed, that the existence of Huguenots would see the end of French society, and they openly persecuted them. The government sent armies to defeat Protestant strongholds. There were massacres in the street, killing thousands of people for their beliefs and education. And this persecution started a mass exodus of Huguenots out of France, mostly to the more Protestant-controlled countries, England, the Netherlands, and parts of what are today Germany. And this exodus really shaped their lives. They were no longer part of France. They were no longer truly French. They were French-speaking, but they were no longer part of that culture. Wherever they went, they were a minority. They were a different other group. And the group that would eventually come here into the Mid-Hudson Valley went to the region of the Palatinate, Pfalz. And it was a part of the Habsburg monarchy, one of the few regions of the Habsburg monarchy that was Protestant in its majority. And they lived there for a few years, hoping that this would be better. Unfortunately for them, it was not any better. And they decided amongst themselves separately that they should go to this new world. And they decided to travel to what was then New Netherlands. And you have to ask yourself, how so? Why? They went to the New Netherland colony for two reasons. One, the Dutch had a very similar form of Protestantism that they held. They were both, on paper, Calvinists. In fact, the churches settled on this side of the river, and the churches settled on the other side of the river shared quite a bit of theology. The other reason they went to New Netherlands is that they were constantly losing wars to the English. So the Huguenots sort of assumed that they could go under the radar and make their own world without having to assimilate into another culture, be it English or Dutch. And they live a few years in the Kingston region until they gather enough goods to trade with the local Native American tribe for their own plot of land and build their own French Huguenot sanctuary. And that today is known as New Paltz, and the location they build their houses, which still stand today, is now known as Huguenot Street. And it's these houses that I interpret every day, and it's those houses that President Roosevelt visited in 1942. And here is a picture of the Beveer Elting House, specifically the house that President Roosevelt visited. On the left, you see it as it was this past summer with our American flag flying. And next to it, as it was in circa 1950, more or less how he saw it. And it's with that I start to tell this wonderful little story. But there's a bit of a problem with this story. No one really took any good notes during his visit. So you have multiple accounts and multiple sources, and they disagree on a number of points. The biggest one, when did this happen? So in the 1980s, there was a newspaper article that said it happened in October 1943. We have Bob Lasher's account, who was actually there guiding President Roosevelt around. He said it was somewhere in the summer of 1942. And then we have Dina Du Bois's account, the granddaughter of the woman who FDR visited, who goes along with her cousin Bobby, as she called him. And he and she both agree summer 1942. I do my own little bit of digging, and I tend to agree with Dina that this must have happened either in July or August of 1942. And so, and here is Lynetta Elting Du Bois and her two little kittens in the Beveer Elting House in 1946, just a few years later, to give you an idea of what was there when FDR visited. And the story goes that Bob comes rushing in, banging on the door, bothering his cousin Lynetta. FDR's outside. There are police everywhere. He's with the Queen. And she takes him skeptical and says, yeah, and I'm sure Stalin's with him too. And he's, no, I'm serious. He wants to see you. He wants to see the house. So she cleans off her hands. She walks outside. Her jaw drops. There is President Roosevelt, his son, and Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. This is another point which the 1980s article seems to get a little confused. And some of the other recent articles, they say it's in 43 with Queen Helen. But the people who were there all agree that it was Queen Wilhelmina. And if you look at her accounts and her itinerary, I'm nearly 100% certain. History's never 100%. But I, without a doubt, can say it was Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. And so they walk into the house, they talk with Lynetta, they see this room with the antiques and the family heirlooms. I'm sure they had to step over the cats as they walk around. And this is one of the first times I really have to stop in my research and go back. And they all say that President Roosevelt was walking. And as I'm sure we all know, President Roosevelt could not walk. He had polio, he had leg braces, but to tour the house, I don't really think that the leg braces were necessary. And so I asked, how could he have been walking around? Did they just miss this detail? It's never answered. I personally think that their memory of this event has this historic figure, this man whose silhouette you pass to enter this village. He's such a big, historical, mental figure that the memory of it has him walking around and not in his wheelchair. Otherwise, it's unknown to me whether or not he physically walks around this house. But he walks around the house, he sees the heirloom, she pulls out some tobacco pipes and tells some family stories. I'm sure some of the family stories we tell in the house today. In fact, there's a little trap door right underneath the cats. And I'm sure he's very interested, and at the end of the tour, she says, "Thank you so very much, Mr. President, for visiting this little old house." And he stops her and says, "No, Mrs. Du Bois, I was here to visit you." And I find that so moving. And when I first read that, the cynic in me said, well, this is just him on the political campaign trail trying to sway an old Republican woman to vote Democrat in the next election. And to an extent, maybe that's what he was doing, but I think there was something more to it. This trip with his son, with this queen, was really out of their way. Today we think, oh, New Paltz isn't that hard to get to, quick jaunt on the thruway, bing bang, you're there. But he's coming from Hyde Park, she's coming from Massachusetts. They're going to Albany, and if you remember, the thruway wasn't built yet. So they're either going to take 9 or on the other side of the river 9W, quite a ways away to the little old town of New Paltz. 299 was nowhere near the road it was today. So they went miles out of their way to go to a town that historically was Republican and historically after that moment always Republican, to visit this house. And I don't think it was a tourist destination trip. He owns a Dutch colonial house on his estate that looks remarkably similar to the Beveer-Elting house. He has his own private collection of Dutch heirloom items. It's not this simple of a visit to simply wave hello and try to get more votes. I believe he was actually here to see something special. And so his line about, I'm not here to see the house, I'm here to see you, I think has more meaning than I certainly first gave it credit. And so, before I continue, there's a little anecdote, and this is in Bob Lasher's version of the story. So the president is in his car, he's doing his very signature wave, there are police escorts everywhere, and right across the street in what is now one of the buildings owned by the church sits Bob Deo, grimacing. And he can see the motor car coming down, and he's rocking in his chair. It gets closer, it gets closer. He stands up, turns his chair around, faces his own house as the president drives by. And in the story, he says, Huguenot descendant 1, Dutch patron 0. Now, to me, if I was the president, I would, okay, well, fine. But you start thinking about this. In nowhere else in the world at that time could you turn your back to your leader. In Nazi Germany, you would have been shot on sight. In most of occupied Germany, occupied Europe, you would have been sent to concentration camps or disappeared, shot dead on sight. But here in America, you have the president, and I want to think he saw it and he smiled, because this is one of these values that he had his own political belief and he expressed it. He didn't hurt anyone by doing it, he expressed it, and he felt proud to do it. And I think that's part of what this tour with the Queen and President Roosevelt was for, to see Americans. And sometimes you get the very polite, thank you, Mr. President, and sometimes you get Bob Dale turning around for you. But why was FDR here? And I believe it's 2 reasons. It's 1, to see America, but the second reason is that it's personal. He is a direct descendant of the families that founded New Paltz. If you can follow my little genealogical chart, at the top you have Antoine Crispel, one of the 12 patentees, one of the crucial members at making this site happen. He marries twice, actually. He has a daughter named Janet, who marries a Hoffman, who begets a Hoffman, who begets a Hoffman, who eventually marries Jacobus Roosevelt, who has Isaac, who has James, and James has Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But on the other side, you have Eleanor. And she, through very similar, although distant relations, can sort of connect her way back as well. But it's the middle name, Delano, which is another example. So Delano is, I wouldn't say a mistranslation, but its root comes from Delanoy, which is a French Huguenot family. They have actually a very similar story to our Huguenots. And the reason why I spent so long defining what a Huguenot is to group the Delanos and the Crispels as truly Huguenots, because they are from a part of Northern Europe that is very complicated, specifically in the region between Calais and what is today Belgium. And this is a region that had passed through thousands of hands. One year it could be English, the next year it could be Spanish, and then independently Dutch, and then French, and then Spanish again, depending on who's king, whose son is going to become king, and who's angry at who next. Geographically, they are Walloons, which is a geographic physical location. And there are people out there, people I disagree with personally, but people out there who say Walloons are not Huguenots, because they use a very strict geographical definition. But people didn't associate with their greater geographical location, certainly in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. They were more concerned with their church and the culture they worshipped in. And so the fact that they spoke French was far greater than the fact that they were technically being ruled by an English or Spanish or German king. And the fact that they spoke French and were Protestant meant more to them than which riverbank they were living in. So the Delanos and through the genealogy, the Roosevelts are Huguenots. So he's coming home. He's visiting a site in which he can physically touch the remnants of people that shared very similar cultural traits as he. He's very famous for giving his speech on the 4 freedoms. This idea of, the freedom, the freedom of want, the freedom from fear, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of faith. These are ideas that directly tie into his family's history and this Huguenot history. The freedom of faith very easily comes to mind. These are people who were persecuted for their faith. The freedom of speech, these are people who were persecuted for wanting to study the Bible. One of the biggest issues the Catholic majority had in France was the fact that they wanted to print the Bible. To the Catholics at the time, that was sacrilege. The Bible was for only the elite few who could study Latin, who was trained. The idea that a common man, if he could afford it, could buy a Bible and read it himself and come to his own conclusions was heresy, was absolute horrible. But they thought otherwise. They believed that, no, we have a right to educate ourselves and a right to think for ourselves. This freedom of speech. And the freedom from fear. These are people openly persecuted. They either firsthand experienced the atrocities of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the sack on La Rochelle, or heard about it from relatives. This is a tight-knit community. People are related throughout Europe. This is a community who talks to each other, who tries to communicate with each other, because this isn't just word from upon high. This is people studying and eventually, I'm sure, disagreeing about religion. And that's why today there are so many different sects of Protestantism, because people disagree and say, well, no, this is not true, I believe this, and they separate and form their own church. In fact, that's how the Delanos arrive in America. They travel to this same region. They associate themselves with what they called the separatists. Today we call them the Puritans. And they are in the second ship to arrive in Plymouth. And so they have a very similar story. They just ended up a few miles north the coast. And so it's these ideas that bring these people here. It's these ideas that they found their societies. And it's this idea that Roosevelt's entire political thought is formed. And whether he knew it or not, he was questioning that. And when you read his diaries or you read his speeches, you can see him using history often as why he thinks the way he thinks, why the American people think the way they think. And so, well, I had the 4 freedoms. The last freedom that I mentioned, the freedom of want, is an interesting concept. They, at the time, were struggling. And they were told that on the other side of this ocean, there was greener pastures. That you could go over there, you could make your own and survive. That you weren't going to remain stuck in the squalor of a medieval city or waste away in the pastures of a manor house's farmlands, that you can go on your own and create something of yourself. And it's the least, in my opinion, the last sort of freedom that you can kind of attach to, that I deserve to be free of want. But it's an idea that America is really based on, that you could do this yourself, that if you want something, you have the right to go out and get it yourself. And it's also part of this Huguenot migration identity, that they came here for themselves, that the group that founded New Paltz so they could have their own private group, that they can, for themselves, create their own sanctuary. Now, time and history will tell us that little experiment did not work. Eventually, their Dutch neighbors move in, and they intermarry with their Dutch neighbors, and they in fact lose their French language, start speaking Dutch, as so many in this region did, and eventually that breaks away to the British, English, American culture, where today we don't say Dubois, we say Dubois. But it's this idea that you continually question your values. Well, we no longer value the French language, we value the Dutch language for various reasons. But they keep these identities, in part because the cultures shared these identities, but in part because they truly believed them. And it's this visit that FDR experiences this. He, I believe, is speaking the truth when he says, I'm not here to see the old house, I'm here to see you. She is the physical embodiment of someone who was raised with these values, very similar values to his own. She represents these 4 freedoms, that she is there because she values and because her ancestors valued freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want and from fear. And he is showing this queen, America, and a part of America that he connects so well to, and that she, as someone from the Netherlands, as someone who is Dutch, can see how the differences between the Dutch and the Americans aren't that great, that as a Protestant nation, they hold these very same values. And so, in this story, when I first heard it, sort of ignored, yes, there was a royalty there. But when I dug deeper, I became fascinated with this Queen Wilhelmina from the Netherlands. She is a fascinating person who really epitomizes World War II. To give background into her character, I've discovered Queen Victoria's diary. And in the diary, she says she's very pretty, speaks perfect English, and carries herself as a proper princess should. She'll make a fine queen one day. And she does. The Dutch are absolutely in love with her. And she is very strong in not supporting her fellow European leaders in appeasing Hitler while he's annexing various regions of Central Europe. And that backfires, so to speak, and in May 1940, Nazi Germany invades the Netherlands, and she is forced to flee along with her entire government to London. And she's part of what they call the government in exile. And in London, she still communicates with her people. She goes on air and sends radio broadcasts across the channel to the Netherlands, promising her people that she remembers them, that she cares, that she's there for them. She does the same for the Dutch holdings in the Pacific Ocean, who are being constantly berated by the Japanese. And she promises the few holdings in the Caribbean that she will not allow the U-boats to torment them as well. And she is still very active in this government. While away, her prime minister, whose name I cannot remember, unfortunately, tries to, through back channels, sign an agreement to switch sides and join the Nazi cause. And she, on the spot, without consulting anyone, fires him and picks a new prime minister. Today, we would declare this a bit of tyranny, but at the time, it was absolutely the right decision. And she does this weeks after her carriage was bombed during the London bombings. Her car explodes. She, as the story goes, although it might be a little fantasy, she crawls out of the shell of her car, gets another, goes back to her estate, and continues running the government. And so we have a wonderful quote from Winston Churchill, who's so full of wonderful quotes, saying that she's the only man with any balls in the government's in exile. And she is this pretty little princess, or at the time, this regal queen. And this is the kind of person she is. And in 1942, she spends the summer, 48 days, in America. She spends most of her time in Lee, Massachusetts. She visits Boston. She visits New York City, Washington, D.C., and eventually makes her way up to Albany, to the First Church, to celebrate their 300th year anniversary, a Dutch Reformed church founded by the same religious group that she, in a strange way, is the head of. And it's, I believe, on this trip from New York City to Albany that she stops to Huguenot Street. And at Huguenot Street, she discovers the same things that President Roosevelt discovers, that these people truly hold these freedoms, that they are a resilient people, that they are a passionate people. I'm sure she saw Bob Dale turning around. I'm sure she was interested in the little knickknacks Lynetta was able to show and the story she was able to tell. And this trip ends in August 6th, 1942, with a speech at Congress, a speech that was broadcasted to her Dutchmen at home, and it's a very powerful speech in which she relates the history of the Netherlands and the history of America together. And she continues to cite the values that Americans hold, that these four freedoms President Roosevelt goes on about truly are the four freedoms that all Americans hold, and that the American people are resilient, that they would not tolerate any of this for one single moment. And then she uses the personal history between the Netherlands and America. She quotes multiple people during the American Revolution, citing the alliance between the Dutch and the American Revolutionary Group, and goes on about how that relationship was crucial, that the one group could not survive without the other, and that we should remember this, and that it is true today, that the one group, now in this case the Netherlands, could not survive without the Americans, and that the Netherlands, because of their similar history and their similar wars of religion, hold these same values, that they value the freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. They want to be free from fear and free from want. And that these are all values that she saw on her tour of America. And I am convinced that this short little visit to Huguenot Street absolutely painted this and solidified this idea in her mind, that sweet old Lynetta energetic as he's described Bobby Lasher, and even, who sounds like a mean person, Bob Dale, they are Americans, and that they hold all these truths, and there's power in what she saw, and there's power in her speech. And this all connects to her own personal story and her own personal history, the same way it connects to FDR and his personal history, that these people and their individual histories are interconnected with this greater cultural history. And that brings me back to my very first set of points, that your own personal history is shaped from not only the moments of your life, but the moments of your parents and grandparents and ancestors. And that together as a collective, we share the very values that the Queen and the President were speaking about. The freedom of fear, or from fear, the freedom from want, the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech. These are all crucial parts, defining parts of our culture. But I will ask the group, if you can indulge me a little bit, to answer me a question, so what? Nobody? That's okay, I came prepared. The so what is that they had to question that. And today we have to question that. Our society constantly faces new questions, new challenges, new problems that have never been faced before. And we have to ask, do these values still hold up? Do these values mean the same thing that they did to my father, or to my father's father, or 300 years back? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. We look back at the American Revolution and we often act quite cynical and point out the failures, that yes, they signed all these wonderful documents, said these wonderful words, but they kept their slaves. They didn't even give a consideration to the rights of women, that for the average man, nothing really changed when they were ruled by a president or when they were ruled by a king. But that changed. The next generation fought a little bit more, and the right to vote expanded to all men regardless of property ownership. And a few generations later, unfortunately quite a few generations, but a few generations later, that was challenged again, and we gave rights of citizenship to all men, regardless of race or creed. And relatively recently, we gave those rights to women as well. And now we have to face these challenges again, and we have to question, why do we hold these values? Are they still true? Are they still right? And do they define us the same way? You can ask those questions personally, and hopefully everyone in our culture answers them personally, and our culture will grow and evolve. And I truly believe that these values make America America, and they will never go away, and that as long as we keep questioning ourselves and our history, that we will continue to believe in these sort of values and practice these values. And so that one day I can be a grumpy old man and the president can drive down my street and I can turn around. And so what can this specific story, this specific lesson teach us? You know, I asked the so what. Now you have this wonderful little story. What does it show you? What does it tell you? It tells you the importance of history, of questioning that, of really testing and experimenting. Go to a historic lecture and listen to a guy talk. Go to a historic site and witness and experience the event. Read a book and study and learn, so you can then question and find out who you are and what you hold. President Roosevelt would not be as articulate and as powerful a speaker as he was if he was just sort of winging it. He questioned his history, he questioned his values, and he determined that yes, these are true, yes, I hold them, and that I should share them. And he did it wonderfully, and it greatly affected the American people and really got them through the war, listening to this man speak about these things and understanding and knowing that, yes, these are true. This is what makes us special, and that is what will ensure that we continue. And so I hope that in my little speech lecture here, that you asked, so what, how so of what I was telling you, and that you'll go on and ask yourselves the same sort of questions of your own personal history, of culture, of things that happen in the next 10 minutes. So, are there any questions for me?
We have a wireless mic.
Oh.
Anybody?
Oh, surely my whole point of asking questions provoked a question. Yes.
Did Queen visit the Reformed Church? When she was in New Paltz on Huguenot Street, did the Queen visit the Dutch Reformed Church? Right across from the building?
Yes, I know the Dutch Reformed Church very well. All the accounts of the stories we have, the only building they entered was the Bevere-Elting house. But the path it seems they took started by the Freer house, and they certainly would have went past the church itself. They didn't enter it. I'm not sure why. But they certainly saw it, and they certainly spoke to a member of that church.
Anyone else?
Was she still queen when Kingston celebrated their 350th anniversary? Sometime I thought it was like in 55 or something. And she came to Kingston.
I am trying to remember when she passed, and I believe so. I am uncomfortable giving you 100% yes, but I believe she was.
Anyone else?
Just a comment on translation of the Bible into English and,
Sure.
and people getting involved physically with the Bible. Henry VIII was excommunicated by the Pope, and he returned the compliment. He excommunicated the Pope. So he felt it was a standoff, and as far as Henry VIII was concerned, he was still a good Catholic. But what he did was had the Bible translated into the Vulgate, the English language, and placed the Bible on the altar of all the churches, and it created a sensation. The churches were open 24 hours a day, and the lines were for miles. People standing in line night and day, waiting to go up and touch the Bible and read it in English. It was a sensation, and it was the first time they had ever had that experience.
It absolutely was, and it was such a momentous occasion. This really changed the world. It was, without a doubt, a revolution. And looking at sort of the villains in these stories, the Catholic aristocracy who openly persecuted, you could see why. These are people who are now challenging the very source of power they had. The King of France is the King of France because God said so. And now you're questioning all these rules that we were just telling you. You're discovering what the rules really are by reading the Bible yourself and coming to the conclusions. And when you say that the only rules you need to follow are the ones said in the Bible, then I don't need to listen to a pope. I don't need to listen to a king. I don't need to do any of the things I've been told for centuries to do. I can discover these things for myself. And so that's how you have this open battle, these wars of religion, killing fellow Frenchmen and going into other countries. One of the main reasons they left the German Palatinate was because they were convinced, and they were right, that the French kings would expand these war of religions outside the borders of France and start persecuting Protestants across Europe. And so this was a revolutionary idea. The Catholic Church, a few generations later, would have their own Counter-Reformation, in which they, in my mind, wisened up and allowed people to read the Bible in the vernacular. But it was absolutely a revolutionary, momentous change that educated most of the European population.
Tom, would you please talk about tours of the Huguenot houses?
I can absolutely talk about tours of the Huguenot houses. In fact, it was going to be my very final remarks. But I, the wonderful staff, some of whom are here tonight, have the houses open for tours. Weekends only, starting in April, so not too far away. And then once May arrives, nearly every day except for Wednesday, in which you can tour the houses, including the Bavaria-Elting House, and experience the same experience President Roosevelt felt. And we offer a variety of options depending on how you like your history served. We have costumed interpreters sharing in-the-moment tales, and we have docents, guides in present-day clothes, sharing historic facts and provoking questions alike. We also have quite a number of events, and as you leave this evening, I have a set of cards outlining the calendar of events.
Anyone else?
If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you all, and I would like to introduce Marietta Schneider, a descendant from the 12 patentees and someone with close ties to this very congregation.
Thank you, Thomas. I have to disagree with Thomas on one thing. I don't think the trip from New Paltz to Hyde Park is that fast, and we proved it tonight when the traffic was backed up. So we certainly are sorry that the Mid-Hudson Bridge was bumper to bumper this evening, because it was really important for us to be here tonight. And first of all, it's an honor to be able to share some of the stories of Huguenot Street. We really do hope that you'll come visit. We are open all year by appointment, and it's not, we do scheduled things, but we would love to invite this group, or if maybe somehow connect for a special tour of the street, and relate and kind of see some of the things that were expressed tonight. So, Sue, thank you for arranging this. What Thomas alluded to is that aside from being descended from Huguenot Street, there are 30 million people alive today that descended from that little street across the river. And I bet some of you in this room, that's 10% of the US population, and I bet some of you sitting in this room are descended from Huguenot Street as well. It's almost inevitable in any kind of, particularly given your proximity. But this particular place is also very special. In many ways tonight I felt like I was coming home. I was baptized in this chapel 60 some years ago. And it has very special meaning for me. My sister was married in St. James Chapel. You all know that this was clearly the church of the Roosevelts, but there was another side of the Roosevelts that, or maybe it wasn't another side, but also a side that Thomas was talking about. They were so open to the people that lived in this community. And when there was a memorial service for President Roosevelt, my father was the Boy Scout master at the time. He was honored to be able to put a wreath on Roosevelt's grave. And they got a little invitation for a tea at Weikel Cottage from Eleanor after that. But that's the type of people that they were. And they were open to the community. This was their home. There was nothing, no barriers between, just like walking up into the house, there was no barriers for them. And I can see on your faces that it still feels that way, that it's a very open place and welcoming. So we welcome you back to Huguenot Street just as you welcomed us here tonight, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you very much.
about the Huguenots in the local schools, at least when I went.
It's a tragically untold story.
You know, you may expect to see a number of us visit
I hope
in
I
the
do.
future. And an appreciation for your efforts to get across the river to Hyde Park. Here's a little gift for the Huguenot Society. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you both, Thomas and Marietta. We're so glad that you came in spite of the fact that how long it took you to get here. We do appreciate it. Some additional thanks tonight to some of the folks who have been helping out. John and Gloria Golden, of course, who have restored the chapel and made it available for the community to use for things such as the Fireside Chat. Tonight, Randy Soden is helping us with our technical needs, as well as Grant Ferris. Deirdre Micker is coordinating our reception tonight. And Herb Sweet in the back is recording tonight's event. And if you have friends or if you just want to see the chat again, it will be on YouTube. Now, I'm not sure I have this correct. Herb, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But you go to the church's website, which is on the back of your program, and then just scroll down, and on the bottom of the page, there's a picture of the church in black and yellow, and you just click on there, and you'll be able to listen to the chat again. Did I get it right? Good, okay. And also the many behind the scenes volunteers. We thank you all so much. And we thank you all for joining us tonight for this very informative program. And I personally hope that you'll take the time to visit historic Huguenot Street this season. It's a very special experience. In the moment, tours are given on the weekends, yes, and then by costumed interpreters, and then traditional guided tours are given during the week. So you have your choice, as Thomas mentioned. Thomas and Marietta and the staff will be inside during our reception to answer any of your questions and perhaps arrange a tour with them. So we do hope that you will join us in there. Before we do break to go in for the reception, I want to mention the last program in our Fireside Chat, which will be next month. It will be, and it's on the back of your program, presenters Linda Boucher and Al Vink will once again be joining us with a new program about FDR and his leadership abilities in spite of his own physical limitations. So I know that you want to be here for that as well. So give us a couple minutes to clear the chairs, and please join us in there for refreshments. If you can't stay, please have a safe trip home. Try and avoid the mud. And please be back here on April 9th. Thank you so much for coming.